Chapter 8. Vigil. Reyes hovered over the still form of Gaggara, his eyes glued to her face, waiting for a sign, any sign that she might recover, his ears tuned to the very shallow, almost inaudible sound of her breathing. Absently he took one of Gaggara's hands in both of his own and stroked her flesh gently, willing her back to life. Gaggara lay there, quiet and unmoving, her eyes closed, as if she were merely sleeping. Her head was turned just slightly to the side, as if she was looking purposely towards Reyes, but she remained otherwise unresponsive. It was a quiet night. There were a few sounds coming into the room from outside, but they seemed somehow distant and muffled as they entered through the illusory barrier. Somewhere a cat started to sing for a mate, a horse neighed, and the many crickets that lived in the area of the encampment began to chitter to each other. Inside the room there was silence, other than the occasional creaking of one of the tables whenever Reyes shifted his weight. Even Mangloss was silent as he slept. Reyes couldn't even hear the old mage breathing. Immediately outside the room Reyes could hear talking. Hedgecough and Tanegi were still there, waiting for Reyes to reappear and join them. At first they had spoken barely above a whisper, but soon Reyes could hear them clearly. Reyes didn't know his night bodyguards well enough to recognise which voice belonged to which girl. "So, what do you think of her so far?" It sounded like a lazy question. The question of someone who was getting bored of standing out in the cold night air, and who thus wanted to replace that boredom with some sort of stimulus. "What do I think of who?" The answer sounded a little bit puzzled. "Our new chief." "What do you think of our new chief?" Reyes was certain this had to be Hedgecough speaking. Even though her voice was muffled, there was a certain intonation to the way she spoke and the way she elongated certain words, almost to breaking point. "Well, I'm not really sure." Now that was the voice of someone hedging her bets, not wanting to make a judgment until she knew what the other was thinking. "I mean, I've hardly known her all that long." "I think she's strange." That simply had to be Hedgecough. "Well, yes," was the reply. "She seems to be able to use magic. It's almost as if Lammerwort is back among us. I've even heard some of the girls suggesting that she really is Lammerwort, back to guide us to greatness. I'm not sure I believe in all that nonsense. You have to admit, though, she has some very Lammerwort-like qualities. She has friends among the humans. Lammerwort never befriended any humans." "No, but she did make peace with the elves and the goblins. Maybe she's just picking up where she left off." "Maybe, but Handsome is male. She's our chief. Every reference to Lammerwort marks her as a female. A huntress. A good one, but a huntress nevertheless. Do you really think that Lammerwort would be willing to return to us as the wrong gender?" "I don't know. I do know she's done some very strange things since she became our chief. I mean, she went out of her way to take control of our village. Then she sits back and refuses to conduct any of the duties of a chief. It's as if she isn't really interested in girls. Except for that Gaggara. I think she's totally enamoured with that Gaggara. I mean, look what we've done for her today, in the chief's name. She's gone out of her way to save the life of one huntress. It's almost as if she cares." "She does care. It's weird. Most males, and quite a few huntresses, would have looked at Gaggara and decided that if she couldn't watch out for herself, then maybe she shouldn't have been leader in the first place. Life would have gone on, and we would have gotten a new leader. Not Handsome. She brings her here herself and watches over her as if she's the only thing in the world that matters to her. I think the elves call it love." "Love?" was the reply. "A harpy has no time for such things. It's selfish is what it is. Our village has just one male. There are 300 huntresses, all of us wanting to be with that one male. And she spends all her time with just one huntress, to the exclusion of everything else. It's not right." "It's not right," echoed in agreement. "You know, I've been thinking that this attempt on Gaggara's life might not be about the leadership of the village at all." "You think not? Think about it. With Gaggara out of the way, might Handsome not be willing to honour the rest of his duties as our male?" "Maybe," came the uncertain reply. Reyes couldn't help wondering if everyone in the village thought his name was Handsome. Obviously they must have heard Gaggara refer to him by that nomenclature, and had assumed it was his name. For a moment the voices of the two huntresses went silent. Then one of them, the one Reyes thought was probably Hedgecough, said, "Do you want to play a game? I'm sure we can find a few small stones scattered about that we can use." "What sort of game?" the other asked. "I don't think Handsome would be happy if we tormented any of the locals." "Something simple then," came the reply. Reyes tried to ignore them. Although he might be interested in watching a couple of his huntresses play a game, he didn't care too much for hearing about it merely from the comments of the two as they played. He found that as he had listened to his bodyguard's chat, he had turned his head a little towards the illusory wall that marked the entrance to Mangloss's room. As he turned his head back towards Gaggara, for the most fleeting of moments he thought he saw a shadow caressing Gaggara's head. Fear clutched Reyes' heart. Had Lammerwalk come to claim her prize? Well, the shadow had vanished the second he had looked at it. Considering how dark the room was and how scared he was for his girlfriend's life, he was soon able to convince himself that he had imagined it. The hour grew steadily later. Reyes didn't move, keeping his gaze transfixed on the girl lying on the tables in front of him. Although his ears seemed to pick up every stray sound, he tried to keep them concentrated towards the girl he loved. Then the night ended. The sunlight of the early dawn found its way into the small room through the illusory wall and added a little bit of light to the place. For a moment, as the first rays of light entered the room, they seemed to settle on Gaggara lying on the table. For the merest of moments, Reyes imagined that the very gods themselves had decided to get involved. Then the light diffused more throughout the room, and the effect was lost. There was a new voice outside the room. Reyes recognised it more clearly than he had those of the other two. It was Quinagoff. Evidently she had found out where Reyes and his two nighttime guards had retreated to. Now that it was daytime, Quinagoff was here to take back her post. "Is she here?" Reyes heard Quinagoff say. "She's in there." Reyes wasn't sure which of the two gave the reply. He thought it was more likely to be Tanegi, though. "Why are you two out here?" Quinagoff asked. She sounded a little angry. "She didn't want us in there," came the simple reply. "She asked us to wait out here." There was a sort of grunted agreement from Quinagoff, and then she said, "At the very least you should be standing by the doors." No, someone replied. "She's in there." A moment later a disembodied hand seemed to appear in the wall, only to vanish again a moment later. For a moment there was no reply, but then Reyes could hear Quinagoff speaking again. "Very well, I'm here to replace you. Heshkov, I want you to return to the village and find a replacement for Tanegi to accompany you tonight." But Reyes wasn't sure who was protesting. "Tanegi will be joining me on the day shifts from now on," Quinagoff said. "I understand." Reyes assumed it was Heshkov speaking. A moment or two later the sound of wings marked the departure of one of the huntresses, presumably Heshkov. Reyes yawned. He was feeling quite tired. He had been up half the night, and that was easy to keep his eyes fixed on the one he loved. His ears kept finding things outside the room to latch onto and listen to. "Handsome." The word was spoken as little more than a squeak, and even though Reyes had been looking right at Gaggara as she spoke, his mind had wandered off on its own little daydream. For a moment Reyes wasn't certain if Gaggara had actually spoken, or if it was just wishful thinking. Gaggara lay there, her head turned slightly towards him. There was the weakest hint of a smile on her face. What struck Reyes as being most important was that her eyes were open and she was looking straight towards him. If that wasn't enough, Reyes could feel her hand wiggle just a little between his own. "Gaggara," Reyes said with a smile, "how are you feeling?" Gaggara seemed to think about the question for a few seconds. Then she said, "I'm alive. I had thought the next time I saw you, we'd both be flying together in Lammerwalk's flock." Reyes grinned. He would never have believed it was possible to grin so widely. Then he stood up straight. "Wait here," he said, cursing himself almost immediately for the stupidity of the comment. "I'm just going to fetch Mangloss." "Don't leave me alone," Gaggara cried. She made a grab for his hand as he released her. "Stay with me." "She's right here, sweetheart," Reyes cooed gently. "I'm not planning on leaving the room." "Good," Gaggara replied contentedly. "Sorry I'm so sick, handsome. Thanks for sticking by me. Not many males would have." "I guess I'm not like other males," Reyes said with a smile. He made his way over to where Mangloss was sleeping. "You can say that again," Gaggara commented weakly, her words slurring just a little. Reyes was certain that she was trying to turn her head to watch where he was going, and worried that maybe she should try and keep still while she was so ill. Reyes reached down with an eye to shaking Mangloss awake, but before he even so much as laid a finger on the old mage's body, Mangloss's eyes suddenly sprung open, as if he was fully alert. Reyes withdrew his hand and said to the old mage, "Gaggara has woken up." Mangloss rolled over in his bedding and gazed up at Reyes. It seemed to take him a second or two to focus on Reyes. He blinked a couple of times and then said, "What?" Reyes had forgotten himself. He had spoken harpy to the old mage without even thinking. Mangloss could only understand the language with the aid of magic. Reyes chastised himself, blaming his error on the fact that he had been up all night watching over his girlfriend, and that the only language he had heard spoken all night was the harpy language. It was an easy task for Reyes to slip back into flourish. Gaggara has woken up. She's recovering. Oh, Mangloss said dryly. You asked me to wake you if she stirred, Reyes reminded, feeling a little impatient. Yes, Mangloss sounded a little grumpy at being disturbed. I remember. Give me a second to get myself together. Reyes stood up again and returned to Gaggara's side. There, he took her hand back in his and gazed lovingly down at her beautiful face. Mangloss will bring you back to full health. Gaggara didn't reply. She just gazed deeply at him and offered him the cutest smile she could muster. It wasn't long before Mangloss joined them. He stood up and wiped the sleep from his eyes. Right, let's see how she is. Mangloss then placed a hand flat on Gaggara's chest just below her neck bone, and the other on her stomach just south of her belly button. Hey, Gaggara said weakly. Watch where you're putting those hands. Reyes smiled at her comment. It sounded as if she was getting better. Mangloss ignored the comment. Instead, he concentrated on his spell. Reyes could see a slight flare of blue from the tips of his fingers as Mangloss sought for injuries. Once again the energy seemed to flow into Gaggara, tinting her with a slightly blue aura. The spell took a few minutes. Mangloss was making a thorough examination of the harpy. Eventually he stopped, lifted his hands, and took a step back, announcing, She's going to live. Good, Reyes said. He looked up at the mage for a moment. I didn't doubt you for a second. Mangloss approached the table again and looked down at the supine form of Gaggara. He found the medallion that still hung around the neck and moved it so that it was lying on her breast, so that she would be able to understand anything the mage said to her. I'm going to risk a full regeneration spell. If it doesn't cure you outright, it should repair your insides. You should still avoid any strenuous activity. It would be best if you stayed here, until I say you're fully recovered. But I must get back to the village, Gaggara protested. I will lose face here. You will always be my first and only. You will always be the leader of our people, Reyes assured her. Please do as Mangloss asks. Gaggara looked up at Reyes and smiled weakly. If it's what you want, my chief, she agreed, grinning playfully. Mangloss shook his hands, as if by doing so he could shake off any excess magic that had accumulated in them. Then he again approached the twin tables and Gaggara. He returned his hands to the places they had so recently vacated. This was a spell Reyes knew. He had cast it himself a few times, although only recently with any real success. Reyes felt better knowing that Mangloss was the one that was going to be doing the casting. Mangloss concentrated, and once again the mage's hands seemed to flare with a blue light as power was channeled through them and into Gaggara. It tickles, Gaggara commented, suddenly sounding a lot stronger. I'd still give it a week before you try to go anywhere, Mangloss suggested. A week? Gaggara said worriedly. She looked up at Reyes. You'll be here for me, won't you? You'll spend every day with me. I'll be here as much as I can, Reyes agreed. Good. Gaggara sounded content. I have some good news for you, Mangloss commented. Although he had finished casting the regeneration spell and had removed his hands from Gaggara's body, he was still sending small tendrils of power into her. What is it? Reyes asked. Do you remember I told you that I thought it would be a miracle if your baby survived the night? Mangloss asked. Yes, Reyes said hopefully. Well, Mangloss said with a smile, it looks as if we might have that miracle. Your baby is a lot stronger. I'm beginning to feel confident that we can save both child and mother. Thank you, Reyes said in a heartfelt tone. Thank you, Gaggara echoed. She sounded a lot better. Mangloss finally removed the tendrils of magic from Gaggara and returned to the side of the table where his bedclothes were. She's well, Reyes. She'll still be with us when you return from Goldspawn. Goldspawn? Gaggara said. But you said you were going to stay with me. And I will, my love, Reyes assured her, as much as I can. This is something I promised Mangloss I would do for him once I was certain that you were going to recover. Give me a couple of days and I'll come with you, Gaggara suggested. Reyes grinned. It's a quick errand, sweetheart. A short flight to Goldspawn, purchase something that Mangloss needs for one of his spells, and then a short flight back. I doubt you'll even notice I'm gone. Gaggara reached her hand up and stroked Reyes' face gently. I'll notice. Be safe. I'll be back to visit you again before I leave, Reyes assured her. His hand found hers. You're leaving me now? Gaggara asked. There was an edge of worry to her voice. Someone poisoned you, my sweet, Reyes told her. I plan to find out who did it and make them pay. I'll show the village what happens to those who try to kill the love of my life. You intend to kill her? Gaggara said, suddenly eager. I wish I could be there to watch. Gaggara's reaction made Reyes feel cold. All he had thought about since Gaggara had taken ill, other than hoping that Gaggara would survive the night, was how he planned to take revenge on the one who had poisoned his girlfriend in the first place. Even now, though, as he reconsidered things, he knew he couldn't allow the poisoner to live. He would just have to make sure she was killed humanely. Reyes climbed to his feet. He took hold of Gaggara's hand and kissed it. Then he lowered it slowly to her side. I'll be back soon, and then I'll spend the rest of the day with you. Love you, Gaggara said. Reyes smiled. He leaned across the table and kissed Gaggara on the forehead. I love you too. As he straightened himself up, he looked across at Mangloss. Mangloss nodded. She'll be safe with me. Reyes blinked once. He nodded back at Mangloss and then glanced one more time at Gaggara, before turning and stepping through the illusory curtain.